Hello and welcome to the Peace Talk, this time with Oliver Richmond. Professor Oliver Richmond is a leading scholar in the field of international relations, peace and conflict studies. He's the founding father of Masters in Peace and Conflict Studies and contributed also to its core modules in the Department of Politics at the University of Manchester. In 2019, he received an Eminent Scholar Award from the International Studies Association. He has worked with international actors, especially the UN, civil society organizations in several conflict-affected areas around the world, and has also conducted fieldwork on local, state, international problems of peace building in Timor-Leste, Sri Lanka, Cyprus, Bosnia, Kosovo, and Colombia. He co-edits a Palgrove book series called Rethinking Peace and Conflict Studies, which seeks to provide a forum for the development of new and alternatives. Maybe we can add critical approaches for understanding the dynamics of conflict and of the construction of peace. Dear Professor Richmond, thank you very much for your time, and I'm very much looking forward to this interview.
My pleasure.
Let us begin with a small journey to the beginnings of your academic career. I'm very curious how it all began and where you started, where your interests come from. And so my first question is, what did motivate you to study? And did you have any academic role models?
Oh, yeah. So digging back into ancient history a little bit, I mean, I did classics, classical history mainly as my first degree, and was always aware of the the kind of deep questions of war and peace in those literatures and the relevance for 20th century history at that time. And for postgraduate, I decided to dig further into that area and did an MA in international relations with some amazing scholars who were then on that program at the University of Kent. And in particular, John Groom, AJR Groom, who was a very dynamic and deep thinker who had a lot of experience in different conflict-affected societies and works a lot on international relations theory and been very much an eminent scholar in the field. Also connected to a previous generation of scholars like John Burton and Edward Azar, and even I understand people like David Matrani, F.R. Hinsley, and so on. And so this got me really interested in the debates about war. And it seemed to me that in John's work and others like Andy Williams and Keith Webb, and later Vivian Jabbery, also Chris Brown, they were constantly pushing at this problem of peace and how we understand it, and has it been theorized, and why is it always lagging behind in the study of international relations? Why is war so central and peace not so central? Even though most historical and contemporary international orders had been shaped by peace settlements, treaties, and increasingly sophisticated methods for creating political order after war. So that's really where I started. And I started, very small with a case study on Cyprus and a very long-running attempt to keep peace and to mediate there, which, frankly, has been stalemated for about 50 years. And so that was a very sort of interesting area. John Groom had contacts there. He worked on it himself, and it became a kind of a topical point of discussion between us. And I started from that, really.
Okay, very interesting. And if I remember correctly, you spent almost 10 or maybe more than 10 years in Cyprus?
Yeah, I did. I worked at a local university there, and I helped set up a undergraduate, an MA in international relations. I did my PhD on UN mediation in Cyprus at the same time. And so I had the privilege, if you like, of getting very localized perspectives, not just reading the literature that had been published in English and was circulating in Western universities. But so it opened up a number of different doors to the possibility that there were perspectives that were not really present in the academic literature, and it meant that new conceptualizations and possibly new theory was possible.
Yeah. And for those who don't know the situation in Cyprus, so there is Turkish and Greece side territory, and what's the conflict all about?
Well, it's many layers of conflict. It's, it was formerly an imperial conflict. The island has been squabbled over by many of the major empires of history, a post-colonial conflict, a conflict over the conceptual frameworks for modern international relations, territorial sovereignty and bordering, and how one organizes communities around ethnicity or religion or language or culture. Later on, I guess, then it became very relevant to modern world affairs because it was seen to be a flashpoint in the Cold War, which carried the risk of destabilizing NATO. It had ideological dimensions too, and it became a testing ground for peacekeeping and conflict resolution methods, for mediation, high-level mediation, and later for more complex civil society approaches as well.
Okay, very interesting. If I remember correctly, when I read your book, you stated at one point that you, in your academic journey, you became more and more self-critical, and it is because of the predominant, so to speak, positivist methodology in not only in peace studies, political science, international relations, and so on. So my question is, how can we explain this predominant position of positivism and the lack of, for example, what I can also see, the lack of critical theories in peace studies, but not only in political science and philosophy? And
yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, and I think it depends on, it has depended on the kind of dominant bias of international relations and the big questions, which have always been about power and war and geopolitics, and later international political economy and ideology. I think, kind of hegemonic dominance, or perhaps a softer form of bias within those systems of hegemony in international relations has driven IR and peace and conflict studies, very much as sort of policy-oriented or policy-driven discussions in scholarship, and has carried through those kinds of bias into the dominant theories and the landmarks of international history, and the conceptual framings and devices and theories that emerged from those. And of course, in the era where I was cutting my teeth in international relations, the third and the fourth debates were, wildly popular, coming through from the margins, introducing new voices and new issues and new actors, new ways of thinking about security and war and peace, and institutions and law and so on. So, you could see that there was a sort of evolution in international relations, where we'd started with sort of very basic parameters about who pulled the strings and why, and then we were shifting towards questions about how we uncover power structures, how it's connected to questions of justice, and sustainability and reconciliation, and what do we do about these previously overlooked questions within those other paradigms, those earlier paradigms of theory. And how do we more accurately and sensitively hear different voices and think about international relations in a kind of interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary way, which also includes these more critical issues.
Yeah, and there's also a form of critique against peace studies. Many scholars said that they are too normative oriented studies, and but and the debate goes on and on. When I read Eckhard Köppendorf and many other founding fathers of peace studies, and the debate is still going on. In Vienna, we have also this discussion, Professor Werner Wintersteiner, and now a few hours ago, I had an interview with Professor Claudia Brunner at the Peace Studies in Klagenfurt, and she also sees this phenomenon that there is a critique. Because of what? Because we do normative research, and that's seen as a lack. How can we explain this phenomenon? Do you also observe this? Did you ever encounter such critique?
I mean, I think a lot of the legitimacy and the veracity of problem-solving theory and also political realism and theories which we would sort of assume don't engage with norms relating to human life so much. Are, they take the view that they are normative, because what they're effectively trying to do in very broad brush ways is build better orders, save the most lives, but do it in a very broad brush way, pull big levers. And there are reasons for that. It's not merely a kind of Darwinian race for power in which the weakest are all erased. So I think it's a bit of a non-critique of peace studies. I mean, clearly, if you're going to have an engagement with peacemaking or peace building and the many other tools that are associated with these kinds of debates, you have to dig beyond with the more complex and more sophisticated methodologies we have. You have to dig beyond these big levers and get to underlying questions. And there's always been a philosophical aspect to international relations and social sciences more generally, as being part of a kind of broader historical understanding of humanities. And of course, peace studies tries to foreground that, to switch us away from a kind of naked focus on power, empire, and state, and charismatic individuals, statesmen, diplomats, officials, and all of that kind of stuff, and tries to, I guess, enter terrains of legitimacy and justice and sustainability. And you can't do that without having a normative understanding of the nature of political order. And I think it doesn't sit well as a kind of universal statement in many human societies to see humans as ends or means separately, but to think more broadly about the relations and ties and values that drive people to act in the way they do, and drives people in peace and conflict studies to think about the different dimensions of peace, whether it's local and everyday to hybrid or state level, geopolitical and global. So I think it's very hard to escape. And this kind of critique, a reductionist critique, in strange ways, is aiming at the same goal, but it's taking shortcuts, and these shortcuts undermine its veracity, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah. It's a very interesting phenomenon, and let us jump now to peace. The term peace. It's a quite funny anecdote. I have to thank on this point Maximilian Lakic from the University of Graz, who drew my attention to your books and to you, because a few weeks ago we organized a small peace conference with local voices from Rojava, northern Syria, from Iraq, and from the Philippines. And when I wrote the text for the conference, he a little bit criticized me and said, Galtung is good, but not good enough. Let's put Oliver Richmond there, and let's frame it differently, and let's title the conference Local Peace Formation. So the conference was named inspired by your emancipatory peace term in this way. So on this point, thank you, Max, for drawing my attention to you. And let's jump right into this term. So what is emancipatory peace, and how is it different to the positive peace concept of Galtung? Do you use Galtung? It is beyond Galtung, and let's begin here. Let's yeah.
So if we start with Galtung's contribution, I mean, I think it's absolutely foundational, and most of us, whether we like it or not, are building on his insights and in the trajectory of his work from other disciplines into international politics and also into political theory. He, was operating in a kind of Cold War environment, in a social democracy, where there was a sense that this had been a very good practical compromise to the conflicts that had riven Europe after, well, in the 20th century, and the ways in which those conflicts had been more subtly and indirectly settled in the absence of a major peace agreement after the end of World War II, effectively, led him to think in these terms of a negative peace, which is sort of centered on the interests of great powers or of power relations themselves within the state, in which very little is achieved apart from stability, and it's just a waiting game for the next war. And from that, lots of other people like Burton, and then later Groom, and many others who then followed, working on peace building, were able to try to take things a step forward, because he opened up this enormous series of lacunas in the way in which we understood peace. And positive peace, was his way of responding to that. And later on, he got interested in culture and religion and worldviews, philosophies, and environmental questions. I mean, you can see the trajectory that he opened up is vital to us all, effectively. Now, I've always found positive peace a very useful jumping off point to start to think about the ways in which human relations and reconciliation at local level are organized, what kind of tools you might think about developing to get a peace that goes beyond the negative, to think about the nature of the state, a more peaceful state, and of course then also to think about global relations, not just formal political relations, but as Galtung makes us think, also about structural and cultural relations and environmental relations as well, from the local to the global. So he sort of pioneered through this conceptualization a more transversal and transscalar, not just transnational, but way beyond that perspective of how we think about peace. And I think many of us who have followed in that path have taken small pieces of that puzzle and tried to create more data-oriented, so more case-oriented, but also more conceptual, more conceptually rich, small pieces of that jigsaw puzzle that he opened up, and to fill in a lot of the detail. And that's become a huge interdisciplinary job, which has drawn in anthropology and sociology and a range of different political and history disciplines and sub-disciplines, including peace and conflict studies. And it's connected with transnational global civil society, with local social movements, with activism, with resistance, with the building of an international legal order and international institutions. I mean, there's so much in it that that's come from those doors being opened, which allowed us to take a much richer approach, I think. And it left us scrabbling around in a huge pit as well, in the sense that we have a huge amount of work to do, but it's become a global project. And most recently, most notably, it's opened up decisive contributions and voices from the global South, East and West, not just Eurocentric contributions.
Yeah. Talking about the Eurocentric knowledge production, reproduction, feminist scholars pointed out that there is epistemic violence also. So when we talk about peace, we have to reduce all the effects of power and all the forms of violence. And you also analyzed that Western rational knowledge about power, interests, and norms leads to a focus on rights, institutions, and also this from above, this perspective from above, rather than people and needs. So this is also a crucial part that I found in your book, and which also I drew a parallel to the feminist scholars who pointed out there is epistemic violence. So which knowledge do we see, do we hear, do we reproduce the philosophical canon, and so on and so forth, and what do we not see, the knowledge of the street, so to speak. And this is also a very important part. This was a big part of our conference. We wanted to hear people from the local communities, from the academia, and what do they see as a positive piece, as an emancipatory piece, and how do they organize, so in a way, in a solidaric way, and so on. So yeah, I was fascinated by this concept. Yeah.
I think the if I may just comment on that, I mean, I think we had a phase in the throughout the 20th century, it was necessary to build tools for dealing with peacemaking in a bipolar international order. And so, to excuse some of those oversights, you could say that the absolute priority was to stop major interstate wars and to mitigate proxy conflicts and to deal with, failed or collapsing states that might well threaten international stability. And of course, intellectually, a response to that is to say, we can see the points of that project, but within the project, there are also many other projects where we're starting to see all of these exclusions, and we take different theoretical perspectives, the feminist, the post-colonial, the environmental, and so on. And the problem is that when we do that, we're kind of increasing the complexity of the peace debate. I do think that we've put a lot of energy into this over the last 20 years or so, starting with perhaps Liederach's work, which is, very important and foundational for thinking about local peacemaking and local peace building. And he was also drawing on an earlier generation of scholars, the Bouldings, for example, and Azar and so on. But what's happened is that we sort of cycled down to thinking about local peace building. We've gathered a huge amount of data and much better understanding of this. But currently we're seeing a massive disconnect between the capacity of those local peace constituencies and tools that we're starting to understand better, and their ability to communicate with the existing more formal 20th century conceptions of political order at the state and international level. And we're also seeing a massive disconnect between policy doctrines and these different parameters of thinking about peace too. So again, we're sort of cycling around, and we're starting to say we've got a bit of a vacuum in peacemaking at the international level now. And we need to, for example, have better multipolar peacemaking tools for the 21st century post-Syria and Ukraine. And we also need to find ways of connecting doctrine. Let's say the UN is now thinking about a new agenda for peace. I mean, how is that going to be connected with the sorts of claims that we're hearing about peace that are coming from much better represented and more active local actors in peacemaking around the world, and also these very changed international conditions?
Yeah. So talking about structures, or maybe we can put it like hidden violence or structural violence. I believe it was in a lecture, you mentioned the role of the IMF and the UN, for example, development programs, and the view that through implementing a liberal, maybe neoliberal system of politics and economics, through this sort of liberal peace building, with you have maybe more stability in some sense, but on the other hand, your local actors were excluded. For example, from neoliberal perspectives, they are excluded of local ownership, and so on and so forth. So we see a negative side as well. So how can we analyze this negative effects? Because talking to my liberal friends, they are so into their ideology that they even don't consider it as an ideology, and they see only the good side. And me as a critical person, coming from an anarchist perspective, I always criticize big institutions, and the bigger the institution, the more I criticize it. So I'm skeptical. So so it's a good positive and a negative side. So how can we explain? And
it's a very interesting question, and I've also flirted with these kinds of debates too. But I mean, to be absolutely frank, looking around my experience of different conflict-affected societies and the paths that have emerged for them in the last 20 or 30 years, I can see, that firstly, the liberal parameters of settlement have been platforms for civil society and social movements, resistance actors and so on to jump on board and to modify, hybridize, and it's been very useful for them. But it's been very difficult to see it implemented at the state level in many peace processes, because checks and balances cut across power relations, and wars are about power relations often. And even if you're no longer using overt violence, these actors, political actors, warlords, elites, and so on, are determined to give up as little as possible, even under the parameters of a peace settlement, which they may well have signed up to. Hence the non-implementation or slow implementation, or the co-option of many peace processes. So, I think it shows you need governments and you need governance. You need some form of government in conflict-affected societies, because if you don't, it will become extractive and exploitative. And that also comes to the question of norms and standards at the international level. Governance needs to be anchored and driven, and this creates problems because we've had a kind of hegemonic Eurocentric moment in world politics, which has been very problematic for many post-colonial and post-Soviet states that were coming out of conflict. And then the other part of this problem is that we increasingly, from the late 1990s into the 2000s, with the war on terror, the advent of state building, and more recently stabilization approaches, we've seen a dependence on capital as a way of producing a peace dividend. So less on institutions, less on rights, less on norms, less on local ownership and engaging with local communities, but trying to get the kind of hard wiring of the state in the context of global capital to do the heavy lifting. And I'm on the brink of saying that's been an absolute failure, because if you look at most conflict-affected societies, you get a sense that even when you might get the system of government to work, capital undermines it, particularly from the perspective of local actors, civil society, social movements. And then when you don't get the parameters of governance to work after a peace agreement, capital exploits it. And so you get kind of pirate capital flows that are exploiting labor and resources, natural resources, following the kind of channels of extractive capacity and these sorts of things in the international political economy. And so you don't really get a peace dividend for wider society beyond a kind of security stabilization. And of course, that's incredibly important, but it doesn't tally well with Galtung's positive peace, nor with the broader thinking that's emerged about the conditions of what I've been calling an emancipatory peace. But in different fora, it might be called human security, or it might be called development, or it might be called the rule of law, or women's rights, or children's rights, or respect and recognition for groups that were marginalized under previous political orders. So there's a lot going on here within the different versions of liberal peace, which is contradictory. and which has, in fact, rather than leading to the slow or quick implementation of agreements, has led to agreements being co-opted or turning into more authoritarian and illiberal models of peace, or frozen conflicts, frozen peace processes, effectively, stalemates, and slow escalation back into division and polarization and possibly conflict in many conflict-affected societies around the world.
Yeah. In your book, Failed State Building Interventions and the Dynamics of Peace Formation from 2014, you described in the preface that attempts to propagate new peace are in part responsible for structural violence. So this is what we are talking about now, that in some sense there are contradictions, and in some sense the Western implementation of Western kind of institution and values in contradiction to the outcome. And if we are looking at the outcome, for example, there was one big narrative, maybe it is still dominant, the responsibility to protect. Since the terror attacks 9/11, maybe before that it was also quite known, we can see what exporting democracy by force, so to speak. What is the result? Let's be empiricist just for 1 second. Let's count the numbers of deaths. Let's be somehow we have to measure. Is it a good thing, this concept of responsibility to protect, or in what sense can it be good? And in what sense did it fail in the past, if we see Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, just to mention a few examples?
I think the problem has been that we, because of these many problems with our peace building and peacemaking paradigms, it began to lose legitimacy in the eyes of conflict-affected populations. And that created a vacuum, which allowed the reemergence of authoritarian, populist, illiberal regimes in conflict-affected societies, and that then restarted this cycle of oppressive politics. So you can absolutely see the point of R2P. There's no question about it, but it is predicated on global consensus. So in other words, you have a global consensus about the best way of making peace, and it's enforceable, and there's political will behind that enforcement capacity. And it's also legitimate on the ground. And of course, the thing about peacemaking, any tool or theory of peace involves losers, if you like, if it is to work. And those losers are the ones who are invested in violence and extraction and instability, who hold different rationalities about why those things are productive forces. And they're also historically the power holders in international politics and in state politics. So what happens, I think, with R2P is it takes on so many powerful actors who are not fully invested in peacemaking that it undermines its own capacity and becomes something of a dead letter. But I think the principle of protecting civilians and creating a platform upon which they make their choices, political choices, and their voices are heard, is essential. And in fact, I think what we've seen over the last 30 years is the possibility that peacemaking needs legitimacy and these broader scientific qualities, scholarly qualities that we're now ascribing to it, but it also needs power. And this is one of its major contradictions, because the power is elsewhere in international politics. It's not with the peacemakers. And legitimacy and popular consensus and consent on the ground has not proven to be sufficient. If you look at Afghanistan, for example, or any country where elections were held with wide support, you can see this sort of paradox that the Western liberal system of checks and balances in a democratic state hasn't achieved what it thought it would. It hasn't created self-sustaining polities which check and balance power and redistribute resources either through a domestic redistribution or in the context of global redistribution. So we've had a very fragile peacemaking system. You might say it's one of the more sophisticated eras, the last sort of 70 years or so in world history, where we've had a more substantial framework for making peace. But it took on a whole range of powerful actors, power systems, from geopolitics to warlordism, to extractive global capital, to the technologists and so on, who, without the capacity to bring them to the table and to check and balance them effectively.
Yeah. Let's jump into geopolitics. Let's talk about the big picture. How does the architecture of the international peace change? So we mentioned the responsibility to protect, but does it change in the past, and how can the so-called Asian century be seen in this sense? So maybe the rise of the BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Bank and so on and so forth, the One World, One Belt initiative and many other projects. And how does it change the rise from the global south, or countries from the global south? How does it change the architecture of international peace?
I think in the 1990s and the 2000s, there was some sort of expectation of a convergence, that Eurocentric paradigms for peace, scholarship and practice would accommodate and develop better understandings of the political claims that were coming from the global south, and that the global south would be interested in building consensus with the global north, and out of that we would get a wider set of parameters within which peacemaking tools could advance. Now, that hasn't happened, and in fact what we seem to be seeing is growing and mutual distrust, and the revergence of Western states to old patterns of thinking about geopolitics, sort of quasi-imperial modes of thinking, very Eurocentric systems for ordering human societies and these sorts of things. I mean, this isn't the basis for a globally peaceful order. It can't even make the UN system, which is grounded in the 1940s, can't even make that work. And I think we've also seen that with the aftermath of the outbreak of the Ukraine war, the very fragile nature of global consensus around political order and peacemaking and justice and development. The BRICS themselves, in that line of thought, were thought to be contributors and strengtheners, of the global international architecture. And it seems to me that there is danger they will turn not just into revisionist actors, in the sense that they all clearly have different perspectives and different requirements of that order, which haven't been equally heard nor responded to. And that's the West's or the global North's fault to a large degree. Much of what was done was really just a sticking plaster. But, it risks turning into a more sort of revanchist type sensibility and a multipolar order. And we really have very limited tools on the table or theoretical paradigms for peacemaking in a world which turns multipolar. So we have the most sophisticated tools that we've ever developed for peacemaking in a world that wants liberal democracy and wants to shift towards liberal democracy as a kind of telos in world political evolution. All of that's been left behind, and we're also standing there naked, wondering what to do next. And I think we need to move now extremely fast to rebuild dialogue, global dialogue, as a precursor to a discussion about international reform, one which is relevant to the world of today and the soon-to-be world of tomorrow, not the world of the 1940s through to the 1980s. That's more or less gone now. So we are in a very tricky situation. Every international order, every domestic order needs peacemaking and constitutional legal tools and development tools. to keep the peace, to maintain security and stability, to advance and to meet human political claims. And, you know, I think many scholars and many practitioners in the UN system and in the donor system, and also in the range of global NGOs, thought that we got there. And now we're standing here again with actually very little.
So to draw a differentiated picture, we have on the one side a Western-oriented peace structure, which is so yeah, we can call it liberal peace building, liberal state building. And on the other hand, there are now this uprising, this new coming forces on the scene, China and BRICS and so on and so forth. So to be critical on both sides, we've seen more than 500 years colonialism, Western imperialism, and it's still going on. It's not something in the past in the history books. It's still going on. We have decolonial and post-colonial studies and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, China is also not a grassroots democracy. So yeah, from a critical perspective, it's also yeah. So not to fall in the trap of this neo-realist or realist approaches of interests and only looking at the powerful. I mean, yeah, of course they have in power, in charge, but to look at the people in China, and I had interviews with academics, I believe that we all have many things in common. War is not necessary. Maybe I'm naive. Maybe I'm just like a small kid, but in my opinion, people don't have interests in wars. Maybe partially, maybe the condition will be better. Maybe we can get some resources that we don't have. But in the long run, it's not sustainable practice. So and here you stated that the global political and scientific consensus constantly ignores the will of the majority of the world's population. And that's when I read that my heart beat it faster, and yes, a light was switched on. And then you described such very important things such as equality, self-determination, participation in the political process, cooperation, social justice, the right to culture, society, and the list goes on and on and on. And so this is some sort of local peace formation that is desirable. So maybe an idealistic, maybe a naive question: how can we implement all these very beautiful terms and things and ideals, and not to be like yeah, how can I say, how to implement it without using force, without being the hegemon?
Yeah. It's a very interesting question, because I don't think in history we've ever really had a peace system that wasn't centered around a hegemon or a hegemonic debate. So it's something of an open question. Now, you know, I like to think of scholarship and the norms and ethics of politics as actually standing outside of practice. And in practice, we can see a range of different ways in which, you know, wars, conflicts, structural violence, cultural violence, and the rest have played out. And we can see what it's doing to the scholarship. I mean, it's driving scholarship to become more complex, more representative, more deep-rooted, more local, more global, to think across generations, to become more interdisciplinary, anyway, to become more critical and so on. But to cut a long story short, you know, what we have is kind of a third position, an epistemological framing of a world that could be, which is far in advance of the worlds that we've had and the world that we have. And so, to cut a very long story short, I think it comes back to education. I mean, so many of these conflicts are driven by a variety of forces: social forces, media forces, geopolitical forces, elite forces, you know, and so on and so forth, which which for many people, I think, in conflict-affected societies and outside of them, come to be shortcuts for making a good life. And the struggle to connect the reality of international relations and domestic politics with this more complex third position of scholarship and what it says, which I think is quite well represented in the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, the Sustaining Peace Agenda, and hopefully in the Common Agenda and the new Agenda for Peace that's going to follow soon. To do that is incredibly difficult. So we have an international and domestic political order, which is, decades, if not 2 or 3 centuries behind what we know about sustainable political order, peacemaking, and so on. So closing that gap would be a good thing. At the moment, the gap seems to be being closed in reverse. I mean, scholarship is being pushed back to these very early questions. I mean, if you are to talk about the main tool that we have for dealing with conflicts in the multipolar order, you'd say first generation peacekeeping, as in the UN emergency force in the 1950s in Egypt, and possibly a bit of mediation and diplomacy between old men who fly around negotiating where borders are, and the withdrawal of forces, and these sorts of things. I mean, not to be too disparaging of it, because it's perhaps what we have to build on again at the moment, but it doesn't reflect the scholarship, which now is much more rich and diverse than we ever had, nor does it reflect the contingent social, political, and economic organizations that have built up around that scholarship, which they both reflect each other. We know the state is inadequate. We know territorial sovereignty is an enormous problem. We know bordering creates conflict. We know the centralization of power is a problem. We know that checks and balances are limited. We know that inequality and unsustainability are problems. We know that violence is passed down through generations. I mean, there's so many things that we now know that we never did, that it makes the tools we have for making peace look antediluvian. So I think these are the things that we can be doing now. There's a huge amount to do to deal with these sorts of problems. Yeah.
Could you see any positive effects or implementations of that, what you just said in Timor-Leste, Sri Lanka, Cyprus, Bosnia, Kosovo, that you did research and that you spent time?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there was I think a lot of different angles and strategies have been tried. There was a willingness on the part at certain moments of policymakers, civil society elites, international actors, donors, to negotiate with each other and mediate each other's approaches. All of these things broke down, and we get stuck in regressive politics or in stalemates or frozen conflicts or situations of cooptation and non-implementation. But I think there's an awful lot that we can see that we could build on and do better, as well as new things to do too. It's 30 years now since these sorts of things were being practiced, and there's been no new peacekeeping operation since the last decade. So again, it's not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because so much of what I'm calling the international peace architecture is built on historical experience. But the trouble that we always see in those cases, and I think throughout history, is that peacemaking tools are developed after war. People lose interest in them after a time. They're always weak. They are opposing very powerful actors, which are often determined not to give up power. In other words, they face implacable foes who will co-opt them and may overturn them. So I think we have a sophisticated knowledge, and there are big steps that we can make if we turn our attention to dealing with these kinds of lacunas and deficits that have become much more apparent in recent times.
I have no further question. It was a delightful conversation. I learned a lot from your books, and once again, I have to thank Max for drawing my attention to you. And yeah, thank you very much for your time and for this wonderful interview.
Thank you very much. Thank you.